Hey guys, my name is Abhishek and welcome back again to MBBS Treasure channel. Today we are going to discuss the next part or the part 2 of apoptosis and necrosis of pathomorphology. So in this today's topic we are going to briefly discuss about the apoptosis and what are the two types of mechanisms through which the apoptosis occurs, that is intrinsic and extrinsic mechanisms. So without wasting time, let's begin our today's topic. In my previous video, I have said or I have differentiated what do you mean by apoptosis and what do you mean by necrosis, and what are the main cellular mechanisms that occurs in the apoptosis. So it is a pathway of cell death in which the cells activate the enzymes that degrades the cells or own nuclear DNA. Finally, the nucleus and cytoplasmic proteins will get degraded through the nuclease and protease enzymes that will be released by the lysozyme. So these are the proteolytic enzymes that will be secreted or that will be released by the lysozymes, and that will be causing its own death that we have studied, that we call as apoptosis, which is energy dependent and planned or programmed type of cell death. The release of the hydrolytic enzymes from the lysosome will be occurred due to the leakage of cytochrome C into the cytoplasm from the mitochondria, because the cytochrome C should be present inside the mitochondria in the inner intermembrane space of the mitochondria. Once the cytochrome C will come into the cytoplasm, then as it is an oxidative type of enzyme, it will cause the lysis, or it will cause the lysis of the lysozyme that will lead to production of the hydrolytic enzymes that will be causing the nuclear DNA or proteins lysis through the protease or hydrolytic enzymes in the cytoplasm. So finally, it will be occurring through its own plant and cell death, because this leakage of cytochrome C is controlled by the different types of genes, and that genes we call like pre-apoptotic genes, then anti-apoptotic genes, then apoptotic sensor genes. And this process of cell death, that is apoptosis, it is a small group of cells in which they will be affected. It means if this is a tissue, then only a small part of the tissue containing the cells will get, and there will be cell death of this small part of the cells, small part of the tissue. In case of necrosis, there will be a larger or big amount of cells will get affected through the process of necrosis. So it is a positive feature of the cell that helps to the cell can retain its the proper functional the cell can retain its proper functional cells that is not required to be dead. But here in necrosis condition, the cell cannot retain the normal functioning cells. So it has to lose the normal functioning cell. So this is the main difference between the necrosis and apoptosis, that this process of cell death affects the small group of cell in the tissue in which it can retain the important functional cells that are present in the tissue, whereas in necrosis it will be affecting a larger group of cells in which the functional cells cannot be protected from destruction or from death. So it is a positive feature of the cell, and apoptosis is considered as a positive feature or good for the cell, so that the tissue can decide that these cells are not so much important and I need to eradicate this kind of cells. So this is a good feature of the tissue. Then, as we have considered that apoptosis is a programmed type of cell death, it should be controlled by some kind of genes, and that genes are divided into three kinds of genes. First one is pre-apoptotic genes, and the second one is anti-apoptotic genes, and the final one is the apoptotic sensor genes. Genes are nothing but the proteins that are present in the cytoplasms. These proteins, the pre-apoptotic genes, these are the proteins which stimulate the apoptosis. It means these are the proteins that will be causing the death of the cell. They will be planning the cell death, and that of the planning of the cell death will lead to leakage of cytochrome C, and cytochrome C will cause the lysis of the lysozyme. There will be release of hydrolytic enzymes, and finally all the cellular materials will be degraded. So these are the important pre-apoptotic genes like P53, BAC, BAX, BCLX5. We need to remember this P53 because this is the most important modulator of the release of cytochrome C, or more important modulator of apoptotic pre-apoptotic genes that will be causing the apoptosis. What do you mean by anti-apoptotic genes? Anti-apoptotic genes means the cells or the genes, the proteins that are present inside the cytoplasm that will be inhibiting the apoptosis mechanisms. Because in a normal cell, obviously, if the cell is properly functioning, so there will be no requirement of apoptosis mechanisms. These proteins that are present in the cells that will be preventing this apoptosis mechanisms, and that proteins like BCLX5, BCL2, MCL1, and sex steroids. These are the proteins that will be inhibiting the apoptosis mechanisms. Then finally comes the apoptotic sensors. Apoptotic sensors means these are the presence in the cellular membrane or the cytoplasm of the cell that will be controlling both of these pre-apoptotic genes and anti-apoptotic genes. It will balance this both. If the cell, it is known as planned or programmed. The cell can decide itself that whether I should survive or I should die. So through these sensors, the cell decides itself that it should release these pre-apoptotic genes or it should release the anti-apoptotic genes. So the sensors that are present in the cytoplasm membrane or the cytoplasms are like BIM, BID, PUMA, NOXA, and BH3. So next we are going to discuss the two types of apoptosis. According to the time of occurring or the procedure or the mechanism of apoptosis, this can be divided into two types, the physiological apoptosis and the second one is pathological apoptosis. How we can understand these two types of apoptosis? When the apoptosis will occur during the normal physiological condition, or the cell will undergoes this apoptosis mechanisms under the normal physiological condition, then we will call it as a physiological apoptosis of the cell. And when there will be pathological apoptosis, like if the cell is already injured and it is affected by the pathological stimuli and then it undergoes the apoptosis mechanisms, then we will call it as a pathological stimuli. Okay, so according to the definition, what do you mean by physiological apoptosis? It is a physically normal phenomenon that leads to the elimination of the cells that are no longer required or no longer needed for the tissue. Those cells are the extra cells that will be present inside the tissue which are no more functional or not required for the tissue will get eliminated through this physiological apoptosis process. Whereas in case of pathological apoptosis process, this mechanism will occur in the case when the tissue get injured and the cells that are present inside the tissue will be converting from reversible cell injury to irreversible kind of cell injury, and once the cell reaches the irreversible kind of cell injury, it cannot return back again to its normal metabolic state. So at that condition, if the apoptosis of those irreversibly injured cell will occur, then we will call it as a pathological apoptosis. So apoptosis occurring in a tissue in which the cells are beyond repairable, that cannot be repaired. It means in the irreversible injured condition. So this physiological apoptosis maintains a steady number of cells in tissue. What do you mean by this? The tissue requires certain amount of or a proper amount of cells inside it for proper functioning of the tissue, and that will lead to proper functioning of the organs. So if the tissue requires X amount of cells inside it, but due to any kind of extra divisional process, there will be production of more extra Y number of cells, then what will happen? For maintaining the equilibrium of number of cells inside the tissue, this physiological apoptosis process will occur, and that leads to the destruction of these extra cells through this physiological apoptosis. Through this, the tissue can retain its normal value or the required amount of cells inside the tissue for proper functioning. Okay, so this method is useful for retaining the property or function of the tissue. Whereas in case of pathological apoptosis, as the cell, as if this will be a cell and this much part of the cell is non-repairable, it means irreversible cell injury, then what will occur? Here the pathological apoptosis will occur and this much amount of cells will be eliminated. And once this much amount of cells will be eliminated, there will be no equilibrium of cells inside the tissue that will affect the normal functioning of the tissue, and that will lead to the tissue damage or disorder of damage. Okay, so now you can understand through the definition what do you mean by pathological and what do you mean by physiological apoptosis. Let's know more briefly these two apoptosis through the examples. In physiological apoptosis, there is the most important mechanisms that occurs in during the process of embryogenesis or during the process of fetal development. Why it is most important? Because if there will not be physiological apoptosis during the development of the fetus, then there will be more and more number of disorders in the newborn baby. Okay. Oh, so how it is helpful? For example, during the process of embryogenesis or morphogenesis or during the formation of organs, that is organogenesis, what will happen? There will be division, there will be more divisional process. Okay, there will be more divisional process from one cell to two cell, then two cell to four cell, and four cell to eight cell. Okay, in this manner, there will be formation of more and more cells. But when it reaches to a certain number or certain mass of cells, what will happen? This cell will get differentiated into different kinds of tissue. In that condition, if there will be extra amount of cells that will be present and that will not be required by the tissue for the process of its formation, then that extra cells will be eliminated through this physiological apoptosis process. Okay, I can give you one example of the disorder if there will not be physiological apoptosis mechanism, that is syndactyly. What happens actually in syndactyly? Syndactyly is a disorder of fused fingers. It means there will be web-like fingers in a newborn baby in which the fingers of the digits are not separated. This happens because in a normal condition baby, what happens during the formation of hand, there will be process of this physiological apoptosis in between the cells that are present in between these digits, so that there will be a formation of furrow in between the fingers, and the fingers of the digits can be separated each from each other. So if this process of apoptosis will not occur between the hands, so it will remain as fused as it was before. So there will be no discriminate apoptosis, physiological apoptosis occurring in the hand of the newborn baby. That will lead to formation of the syndactyly condition. Next comes example is the hormone dependent apoptosis. What do you mean by hormone dependent apoptosis? If the apoptosis is mediated by the some kind of hormones, this case can be seen during the process of menstrual cycle in women and during the process of menopause. because during menstrual cycle, what happens, the cells that are lining in the endometrium of the uterus, they gets breakdown and they will be out through bloodstreams. And this menstrual cycle is essential because the endometrium lining is regulated, or the proper functioning of the endometrium is regulated by the progesterone hormone, that is the ovarian hormone. If there will be fertilization occurring, then what will happen? The endometrium will try to receive the fertilized ovum or the embryo and it will implant inside it, and there will be no further menstrual cycle or no further breakdown of endometrial cells. But in case of, if there will be no fertilization, what will happen? The endometrial lining of the uterus will break down, and that will be occurring through this physiological apoptosis mechanism. Like in similar manner, when the woman approaches the menopause age, at that age there will be follicular atresia of extra ovum that are present in the ovary. Then comes another example, that cells lost during the process of maturation of T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. Why it is essential? Because we know the T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes, they are the important immune responding cells in our body, and their maturity is as much as important than anything else. Because if any kind of foreign antigen will come to our body, then the prior function of the T and B lymphocytes is to produce the antibody against that coming antigen. So if there will be formation of immature T and B lymphocytes, here immaturity means the T and B lymphocytes will not be having the antigen receptors, so that they cannot respond to the coming antigen. So that condition of the T lymphocytes or B lymphocytes will be called as a immaturity. What happens? This immature T and B lymphocytes get apoptized. It means there will be death of these immature and T and B lymphocytes that helps our body to protect from the foreign and antigens. And the as because these cells are not that much important, and that required, these cells are required to die. Okay. So the next examples of the pathological apoptosis we can discuss, that the DNA damage. The DNA of the cells get damaged due to some extra activities, like due to radiation or some cytotoxic factors that will affect the DNA. And once the DNA will get affected of the cell ultrastructure or protein structure or different kind of metabolic disturbance will occur inside the cells. So once, if there will be any kind of DNA damage, and if that cell is not pathologically apoptized, then what will occur in future? The DNA damaged cell will form the different types of malignancy, and that will form the malignant tumor and further causing the cancers. Then the next example is the accumulation of the misfolded proteins. These things occur when there will be extra stress on the endoplasmic reticulum inside the cells. As we know, the main source of protein formation or protein synthesis is the endoplasmic reticulation. If there will be extra stress over the endoplasmic reticulum that to produce the proteins, so it will secrete more and more amount of proteins. And according to the metabolic activities, if the cell cannot utilize the more and more amount of protein, so there it will lead to accumulation of the protein, and that accumulation of protein will cause several degenerative diseases that may happen in the organ or itself in the tissue, or it may also affect the central nervous system. If the uh, diseased or cell that has the extra accumulative protein will not get pathological apoptosis, then it will be causing several degenerative diseases. So the next example is the cell death during the viral infection. This is the most important part of the pathological apoptosis mechanisms. This occurs when there will be an incoming virus to a cell and it will affect the cell, it will change the metabolic activity of the cell and causing the cell injury. During that condition, if that injured cell will not be apoptized, then it will cause more and more disturbances around its neighboring cells and finally causing disease or disorder condition of the tissue. So one of the example is the viral hepatitis. During the viral hepatitis, what happens? The virus will affect the hepatocyte cells of the liver, and the activities or the functions of the normal liver will get affected through that because of the infection of the virus. And if during that process, if that pathological apoptosis will not occur, then it will cause more and more disorder of the liver. Then comes the next example is the pathologic atrophy in the parenchymal organs after the duct obstruction. When the duct of certain organs will get obstructed by any means, then that obstruction is required to be removed through this pathological apoptosis. And if the obstruction will remain for a longer period of time, then it will cause some kind of disorder. So the most parenchymal organs in which this process of pathological apoptosis occurs, that they must be having the duct. So the duct having organs like the pancreas, carotid gland, and kidney. Okay. So in next we are going to read about the extrinsic and intrinsic mechanisms of the apoptosis.